Good evening. Thank you for joining us on this live question and answers about the Island Development Plan review. We're going to try and answer as many questions as possible within the hour. If you're watching on Facebook, you can submit your questions in the comments below. If you're watching on the gov.gg, you can email comms@gov.gg. I am Victoria Oliver, President of the Development and Planning Authority, and I will be taking your questions and inviting different members of the panel to provide answers while answering questions myself. On the panel this evening, we have two other members of the Development and Planning Authority. We have Deputy Sato Councillor and Deputy John Dyke.
Good evening.
And we also have Simone White, Principal for Forward Planning Officer. We want to spend as much time as possible answering your questions, but we appreciate some people might have just stumbled across this broadcast and may be wondering what it's all about. So I just want to take 2 minutes to give a little bit of context to this. The Island Development Plan, or the IDP, is Guernsey's plan for how land use supports the development of business and community while preserving and enhancing the natural built environment. We're carrying out a focused review of the plan to examine how the IDP can deliver the island's priorities. One of the first steps in our process, the Development and Planning Authority is publishing the proposed changes to the IDP. I want to emphasise these are proposed changes. They are not final. To give an overview of the proposed changes, I'm going to hand you over now to Simone White.
Thank you, Deputy Oliver, and good evening. The proposed changes can be grouped into several different areas, including ensuring Guernsey has enough land available for both private and affordable housing, making sure Guernsey has enough land available and the right policies to support business use. But it's also about reducing red tape and removing barriers to development and supporting our biodiversity and clarifying what's meant by the existing policies of the Island Development Plan. So as Deputy Oliver said, we want to make the most of our time this evening, so I'm just going to give a brief overview of the changes. The first set of changes are around housing land supply and our housing policies, and the review has looked at whether we have the right amount of land supply to meet the island's needs for housing over the next 5 years. The Development and Planning Authority have a very important role to ensure that there is the right land supply there for both private and affordable housing. To clarify, when we use the term affordable housing, it is actually a legal term, and it covers the type of housing like socially rented housing, key worker housing, specialised housing, and partial ownership at the moment. But it is defined in law, and when we use it, that's the term we're referring to. It's not what you would consider to be affordable housing that maybe your kids might be able to afford to buy. It is housing for households whose needs are not met or who cannot afford accommodation in the private sale or rental or market without assistance. So in assessing whether we had the right land supply to meet the island's needs, the starting point for the authority is to test this against what the states have set out is the need for housing over the next 5 years. The states agreed this last March, and they have set an indicator for both private and affordable housing, which equates to about just over 300 units per year. The authority looked at this figure and considered various factors that have happened since March, including that there's an increasing trend towards higher population migration than we were expecting, and also that the indicator does not account for key worker or specialised housing. To recognise this, the authority want to make sure that there's a land supply in place to meet the state's indicator, plus some room for wriggle, some buffer. So they have set a land supply or a target of meeting a land supply for the private market housing plus 15%, and for the affordable housing indicator plus 25%. The research and evidence shows that we actually have enough land supply identified within our main centres and local centres to meet the private market requirement. there's no need to look for any additional land or new housing allocations to meet that need. The affordable housing requirement, the research shows there's a shortfall in regards to the land supply for affordable housing. The authority have looked at this, and they've looked at an existing policy that's in place in the Island Development Plan known as GP11. GP11 actually requires private market sites, larger private market sites, to contribute towards affordable housing as they come forward. That policy has not delivered affordable housing to date. So instead, the authority are proposing to remove that policy and to designate 6 new sites that are for affordable housing. In this way, these 6 new sites, together with the sites owned by the states, the existing housing allocation sites, and the sites owned by the GHA, they'll be meeting towards affordable housing. One additional part to making the land supply for affordable housing was they looked at the industrial land at salt pans, and they looked at redesignating that land that's undeveloped and changing it from industrial reserve to a mixed-use development area, where 60% of that land will come forward for affordable housing. So in those 3 ways, the island can meet its need for affordable housing over the next 5 years. I'll just show you where those sites are now. So there are 6 new sites. There are 3 sites which are located in St Martin's local centre, and then there's 1 site in Limon local centre. There's one on the edge, northern edge of the St Peter Port main centre by the Vrong housing allocation, and then there's one by St Sampson's in the Vale main centre, just off Route Militaire. And you can also see on that map the existing housing allocations that are currently designated, which will remain. So they're the main changes towards housing land supply. The proposed amendments have also looked, and the review have also looked, at the land supply for employment uses. By employment uses, we're actually referring to offices, industry, and storage and distribution. So we reviewed how the policies and the land supply is there for those uses over the next 5 years. Again, a lot of research has been done. A lot of this information is available on the gov.gg website for background reading. But to summarise here, in terms of offices, the forecasted need for offices can be met within the current designation for office expansion area at Admiral Park, which I can show you here, is located there. So there's still some undeveloped land within this designation, which can come forward with offices over the next 5 years. There's also opportunities there to intensify land there and bring forward further office accommodation. There are opportunities elsewhere within the main centres as well. In terms of industry, storage and distribution, the forecasts show a requirement for 20,000 square metres of land over the next 5 years. And in terms of land supply, the current policies reserve key industrial areas to support these uses, and they're marked purple on this map. So you can actually see Petronnery Road, Long Hoog, North Side, and the remaining area of salt pans. There's also an area by the airport called the Villiers. Those reserves of land will accommodate and support industry and storage and distribution going forward. Alongside that, the authority are reserving up to 40% of the salt pans mixed-use development area for these uses. Another step the authority are doing to support these sectors is to designate Lowlands Industrial Estate as a business park, which I'll just show you there is hatched blue on this map. This will be for uses like light industry, storage and distribution, offices and comparison retail. This reflects the existing uses that are there at the moment, and the purpose of this amendment will basically help to protect those uses to continue in our operation. They're the main changes for employment. There are others in other areas which are being clarified, but they're the main changes for employment. Some other changes that are being proposed by the authority are looking to reduce red tape and remove barriers to development. So in this instance, one of the proposed amendments is looking to reduce the requirement for development frameworks. Currently, the thresholds are set and they catch sites that are very simple and straightforward and are not benefiting from this extra step of preparing a development framework. So the proposed amendment is looking to change this to just be for sites that are complex and therefore reducing number of steps on certain sites to come forward, but making sure we make the most use of this tool in the future. There will, of course, be opportunities for public to still comment when people are making their planning applications in the normal way. Another area that the authority looked at was extending Limon local centre boundary to include Cattell Hospital. Cattell Hospital, which is owned by the States, has been earmarked for some time to become redundant for its current use and will come forward for redevelopment in the near future. As such, the authority are looking to bring this within the local centre to make it easier to redevelop and invest in the protected building that's there. Under the current policies at the moment, there is an opportunity for Cattell Hospital to be redeveloped. It's just a slightly longer and more time-consuming process. So this proposed amendment is to make that more straightforward. And lastly, one of the main areas is looking to support our biodiversity on the island. During the last public inquiry, when we brought forward the Island Development Plan, we made a commitment to update our evidence base behind this designation. As such, we've done that now, and Environment Guernsey have surveyed the entire island and updated our information. As a result, the new information is showing that we should add up to 140 hectares of land to this designation. It is saying that that's mainly new land or new areas, but it's also saying to remove some existing areas that their biodiversity have diminished and to extend or change the existing areas that we've identified. So in this way, we will be seeking to recognise our biodiversity. A key issue here to stress is that the overall policy approach will not be changing. The designation does not stop development coming forward. It just requires the authority to recognise the biodiversity value that's on that land. So if development does come forward and any harm is caused to the biodiversity, you're required to mitigate that. So overall, there's no loss to our biodiversity value. And that is an overview of all the changes. I'll hand you back to Deputy Oliver.
Thank you, Simone. You can find a summary of these changes at gov.gg/IDP review. We published these changes just over 3 weeks ago, and since then we've been inviting islanders to comment on them. It is really important that these comments are captured. So I just want to remind people that there are only two ways that you can formally comment on these. You can either use the online consultation platform at gov.gg/IDP review, or you can fill out our representation form, which is available online or at Edward Weedon House. If you need any assistance or questions about how the form will work, there will be an officer at Edward Weedon House between 9 a.m. and 4 a.m. on weekdays. The deadline for making these comments are 5 p.m. on the 29th of July. These comments will be sent to the independent inspector, and again, more information about this process will be available at gov.gg/IDP review. Lastly, before we go into your questions, it is worth saying there will be future opportunities to comment later in the year. But any future rounds of comments, it will only be possible to comment on the matters that have already been raised in the first round of comments. So please don't miss this opportunity to have your say. As I said, I want to spend most of the time answering your questions. So now let's turn to the first question of the evening, which is question 1. Paul, When selecting the housing and employment sites, has the DPA considered the infrastructure, power, drainage and road network required for these developments? Sasha, would you like to answer that?
Thank you, Deputy Oliver. The authority undertook a very detailed call for sites process, which looked at the location of the sites, but also considered the infrastructure and consulted with traffic and highways as well about accessibility of sites. So we have considered and prioritized the sites that did have connectivity to basically infrastructure, power and drainage. Having said that, there will always be potential issues with increased development around traffic, etc. And this we will seek to mitigate them once applications come forward and working with traffic and highways and other departments of the state of Guernsey.
Could I add one gloss to
course
that?
you can.
To that? The sites we were looking at, because of our spatial plan, the basic rule in Guernsey is that we can't dot developments all over the island. They have to be in or adjacent to the main centres, the main centre, outer areas, or the local centres. So the sites brought forward are limited by that, and you'll see that there are the 3 sites currently allocated at the edge of St Martin's, 1 in Catel, and 2 smaller ones farther in the north. So we are sticking to that spatial plan of not spreading development higgledy-piggledy all over the island as used to happen in the 70s. So that's a basic framework within which we operate.
They had to be adjacent to the main
Yes,
centres or
adjacent
local
to the main
centres.
centres, yeah. So some of the centres have been slightly extended by bringing these sites into them and redrawing around the edge.
Right, I'll move on to the second question from Jennifer. Why is there no development proposed in St Pierre de Bois local areas when there has been a consultation within the parish suggesting that this would not be unfavourably viewed? If I answer that one, first of all, when the call for sites went out, there was a number of boxes that on that call for sites that you had to fill in, and one was, is the site, would you be prepared for the site to be for affordable housing? None of the St Pierre de Bois local area actually came forward saying that there would be any sites that would be appropriate for development. There was a number of things that also happened with the call for sites was, would the site be developable in the next 5 years? And then it had to go through quite a robust criteria. And I'm going to give Simone just to say what that criteria was for actually allowing the site to progress.
So yeah, again, we looked at the spatial strategy, but other things came into play in terms of whether the land was important for other reasons, like agricultural priority areas or important open land within the main centres, and also looking then at other environmental constraints in terms of biodiversity or heritage, and accessibility and service sites were also a main part of that assessment. So this full assessment and our approach is set out in the report entitled Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, which is available online for you to see. So you can see what categories and what information we took on board while we were assessing these sites.
Thank you. Question 3, Jennifer, this is a follow-up question. Why were the applications for the site primarily fell into 2A, 2B rejected? So in 2A, 2B, there were 13 sites that came into play, and we actually chose the 6 of them that came from there. So that we did actually use that. I don't know if you could give what A1 was, 2B, and I'm assuming there was 3 as well.
Yeah, so there was 5 category of sites overall set out in methodology. Category 1 are within the main centres. Category 2A is within around the main centres. Category 2B around the local centres. So those sites where we looked, the spatial strategy is basically reflected by those categories. So we're looking in and around the main centres and the local centres first. And the call for sites that came forward for affordable housing, because remember, we had actually enough land supply for private market housing. It was only affordable housing that we were looking for additional land.
Thank you ever so much. Question 4 from Jay. What is the definition of affordable? A one-bedroom for 500k is not affordable. I'm going to pass you to John for the legal definition.
Yes, unfortunately, the way the definitions have been drafted, which was some time ago before our time, the definition of affordable housing is a statutory definition, and it basically covers the provision of houses by the states for people who can't afford to buy housing on the private market. So it covers standard social housing, partial ownership housing, whereby you can buy a house from the states and build up ownership from a low percentage up to about 80%. So that's partial ownership. And it also includes specialised housing for the old and infirm, and also within that is key worker housing for example, the nurses we have to bring in to service the hospital and that sort of thing. So what it doesn't go to affordable housing in the sense of an affordable private house that a young couple might be able to purchase to have a couple of children and a dog in a garden. It's a focus really on social housing and related social housing. We are aware of the issues regarding the cost of private housing, which is why we've been making efforts to ensure that what we believe are the requirements to build private housing, that there is land available, and we've added a margin to that to ensure that the land is available to do it. Obviously, the next question arises, is it going to be developed? At that point, the planning authority has limited control. We're looking for private owners private developers to come forward to build. But that is to some extent largely out of our hands.
Okay. Sasha?
I just wanted to add to that. I think the authority, regardless of the IDP review, we're very keen for more affordable housing to come through with small a. Yeah. It's not within directly our remit of the mandate of the planning authority, and we know that our colleagues at Environment and Infrastructure are looking at different potential policies to stimulate more affordable housing development, such as through modern methods of construction, modular building, and things like that. But as the authority's other policies, we are trying to be flexible to ensure that if developers want to come forward with cheaper methods of construction and developing housing, we very much welcome that. Unfortunately, it's not part of the IDP review specifically, but as an authority, we're very keen to encourage more affordable methods of construction.
One thing we have done, if I could just add, we have removed a policy called GP11 following a vote in the States Assembly to re-rate it to 0. That policy provided that if a private developer was bringing forward a development of more than 20 houses, then a proportion of the site would have to be allocated to social housing. And what we'd found was that no developments came forward which were viable in that context. And the view was taken in the States and by the committee that this policy was actually deterring the development of private housing estates, including affordable private housing estates. So that, the proposal is that will be definitively dropped with a view to bringing forward more private development on those larger estates, on those larger sites.
The other thing that we have found quite difficult, when I know developers have found quite difficult on this, is that we've seen finance become a lot more difficult to be able to obtain, and materials are a lot more expensive. So it goes back to what Sasha was saying, that developers need to find different ways in actually building, and then Guernsey comes with its own sort of obstacles, particularly when you're looking at prefabrication houses, because we've got very small lanes and they can only be built when you've got a decent amount of houses and very good accessibility to them. So it is sort of difficult for developers as well, but I would love to see more of the little a affordable houses come forward for youngsters starting up and first-time buyers particularly. Right, moving to question 5 from Peter. Lots of small properties are being replaced with much larger and more expensive dwellings. What do the DPA intend to do to maintain the stock of affordable, low to medium-sized properties? Who wants to take that? Did you want to take? You were taking that
I'm
one.
happy to take that. I think it's a very interesting question and observation. I think what we see in the market is actually all sorts of trends happening. So we certainly see households wanting to develop into larger properties. Sometimes it's also to accommodate multi-generational living. So actually that frees up properties somewhere else. But we also see the trend for subdivision, which is actually you might have slightly bigger properties and you're subdividing them to create smaller accommodation. And we monitor subdivision through the annual monitoring report. So I think the challenges of the authority and an island development plan is that we have to balance out often competing demands. We need to ensure that householders have the flexibility and freedom and the right to develop their properties according to the needs of their families, which change over time. And at the same time, we need to ensure the protection of the environments, the amenities and stuff like that. It's not an easy balance. We hope we try to do it to the best of our ability. But in terms of making sure we have the right stock of affordable, smaller housing, this is where, especially the new development of affordable housing, that we really want to make sure comes through this island development plan review by allocating this additional affordable housing sites.
Also, within the DPA, we for the new dwellings that come forward, the strategic housing indicator actually sort of points to what housing is mostly needed, and it is always sort of the lower end, the 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedrooms. But what I do find quite difficult is that I have a family of 3 and we need a bigger house, but there's very few bigger houses on the market. So we also need people to be going the other way as well. And as Sasha said, that when they do, it tends to get subdivided. But it's a very difficult tightrope to actually walk from the DPA, because there are so many other sort of influence coming from everywhere that you've got to make sure it's balanced. And I'm hoping that with all the evidence that's coming forward, that's what we're trying to achieve. Question 6 from Paul. How many houses is it anticipated that the 60% of the salt pans mixed use development will deliver? So that is going to be, there's roughly going to be 180 houses on that, but there's a lot of things that will sort of actually affect that figure. It will have to be sort of the design of the houses. We're really hoping that the infrastructure around there will actually be improved. So it's making sure that the infrastructure on that site is actually going to be of benefit to the north, and sort of how it sort of links into the, because you've also got the key industrial areas. So it's making sure there's a good buffer between the key industrial areas and the housing of there. I don't know if there's anything anybody else wants to add.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. That site was bought by the States a couple of years ago from a private investor, as well as the potential to use it for mixed housing and other development. It also allows better access, if the states choose to do it, to put a road through to join up with further land inside that area, away from the road that would otherwise be undevelopable. So we're hoping that we can achieve several things with that site, including the site itself and opening up further opportunities next door. So we're quite hopeful that will deliver something in due course.
I think I just wanted to say, ultimately, how many houses will be delivered will depend on the planning applications that come forward between the landlords and developers. But I think it's important to say, and it's a question that has been put forward to us, whether we are encouraging higher density development. And I think it's important to say the authority is absolutely encouraging higher density development across the board and where possible. So, for example, we recently approved the application for the former CY Tire site, which is a really good example of how you can build quite high accommodation in a specific valley setting. So I think we want to take a number of things into account, and I think density is definitely one of them. Being a very small island, ultimately, we need to make the best use of the space we've got. We already have policies that say you need to make the best use of space, and then we're encouraging even better use of space through all of the sites and windfall developments that will be coming forward.
Just on the density, Sasha mentioned the Shirottery, that we can have a lot higher density. Please don't expect that to be put on the salt pans. The density will be where appropriate, and I think that we've got quite a number of different densities to actually sort of show that where density can be slightly higher, where it's actually appropriate to be slightly higher, and actually where it's really not. So they are different levels with the density, and please, Simone, do you want to give the density, a bit more about the density?
Yeah. I mean, the higher, as you would expect, you can accommodate higher densities in the main centre sites. And as you move out from the main centre to main centre outer areas, there's lesser density and lesser again in the local centre expected. But one thing to bear in mind in terms of density, higher density doesn't always go hand in hand with less amenity, etc. Because we actually did a study as part of these amendments, and it's available on the website in one of the supporting documents. It's a density study where we looked at the old town of St. Peter Port and development that's been around for quite some time. It's quite liked and popular, and it's the terraced housing along Stanley Road, old parts of the town. They're actually developed at quite high densities, so you're looking at being able to develop and still provide amenity, high quality design for future residents.
Perfect.
We do still need, and we are aware of the need to provide those family homes that young families are going to need,
Yes,
with a slightly lesser density than the high rises that might go into the Shirottery area.
completely, John. Question 7 from Anthony. What measure have you put in place to prevent deputies or previous deputies from unfairly profiting from land allocated for housing?
Shall I answer that as a lawyer?
Yes, if you want to answer that, John.
That's quite a harsh question. We're quite careful in the States in terms of conflicts of interest. All deputies have to declare various interests, including land they own directly or indirectly in Guernsey, and they have to update their declaration annually. So that's something that's filed at the GREF. In addition, the planning committee, which is us and our 2 other colleagues, we have to, if we have a conflict of interest or a perceived conflict of interest, then we have to declare that to the committee, not vote on the issue, and in fact recuse ourselves from the meeting. In the States itself, the final version of this IDP, after it's gone through all the process, will go to the States for approval. And in the States, any deputy who wishes to speak or vote on something, if he has a conflict of interest, he must declare it before he speaks or votes. He can still speak and vote, but must declare the conflict of interest first. So we've got 3 layers of protection there. And on top of that, I think most of the deputies, I think all the deputies that are elected would not abuse their position. I'm fairly confident of that. But should there be any risk, that is covered at 3 levels of declaration. So I hope that answers the question satisfactorily.
Okay, and Simone, do you want to just talk about the criteria that was actually used to pick these?
Well, then that's to add to what Deputy Dyke said about conflict of interest in the deputies. In terms of our overall approach, the authority have actually been very clear and open and transparent in what they are doing. We have published our robust methodology last year while we were doing the call for sites exercise. So we set out from the very outset how sites and land would be assessed when we were asking landowners to put forward their land for assessment. So there's a robust methodology. It's clear and transparent what we're doing and how we're doing it. So there's no favouritism or pressure or otherwise applied.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, that methodology and that exercise for the call for sites was actually peer-reviewed by an independent provider as well. So it has been reviewed and that it complies with the methodology adopted.
That's right, Sasha. Thank you. Moving on to question 8 from Jackie. As a St Sampson's resident, can you explain why so much of the new development is on our greenfields flood drainage areas and is not in the upper parishes? I'll take this one. I think well, at the moment, there's only one new site that's actually been proposed in St Sampson's for affordable housing. And there are currently 3 new sites that have been suggested in St Martin's, and one in the north of St Peterport and one in Lowmore Centre. I think you're actually talking about the housing allocation sites that have been there for a long time, and they have followed through from the rural area plan to the IDP. The spatial plan says that it should all be concentrated in main centres and local centres. So they could actually be brought forward, but they do have to overcome a number of issues, and those cannot come forward until they've overcome some of the issues there. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I think with some of the existing allocation sites, we have inherited the strategic land use plan concentration of development around the main centres, and I think this is where it's coming from. Just this week in the States, we had a big debate about whether strategic land use plan is still fit for purpose, and it was at in its time more than 10 years ago now a very substantial public consultation which resulted in the strategic land use plan designation areas. I think as also time evolves, we get further data. So, for example, some of the flood data is we get more and more up-to-date information and data, and I think this will have to go into some of the future infrastructure planning and flood defences that the states will have to engage with developers and others. So we also are alive to any kind of emerging evidence that comes our way, such as floods. So, and we take that into account, and the states will take that into account as well in developing their future government work plans.
Yes, we are looking at flood, just for your information, we're looking at flood defences in the context of the potential harbour developments, and that will have an impact quite likely on development of land more inland at St Sampson's because of issues of potential flooding that could arise if sea levels rise materially. So that's being looked at in the context of the harbours, but it does have a knock-on effect.
And some of these sites can't actually come forward until the flood defences have been sorted out, because we want to make sure that we're building homes for the future, not just for the short term. They need to be sustainable, achievable, and also deliverable. So one thing that we want to make sure is that we've got the right locations. And please comment and fill in the form and say if you think that we've got the wrong locations. Simone, did you want to add anything more to that?
No, I think you covered it. It is exactly what you say. It doesn't come forward. Those material considerations about the flooding risk, etc., for every site will be considered by the authority when an application comes forward. Yeah. And as you say, can't come forward unless those constraints are overcome. Perfect.
Right, moving on to question 9 from Graham. How does building on greenfields and agricultural land comply with the strategic land use policy, which is the overarching government policy? Do you want to go for it, Sasha? You can.
Yeah, I spoke a little bit about the strategic land use policy. I think the core of the high-level strategic land use policy is the concentration of development in the main centres and the local centres. And this was at the core of the call for sites exercise and methodology that we undertook last year, which is the reason why all of the new allocation sites are on the periphery of the existing main centres or local centres. And I think what's important to say, actually, out of the 6 new allocated sites that we've chosen for affordable housing, 4 of them are existing or former winery sites. So where possible, again, we're not trying to just go for greenfield sites, we're trying to work with wineries and redundant sites as well.
Yes, and a gloss on that. And I think Simone can confirm this. The two sites we have that are green fields without greenhouses or something else on are not agricultural priority area. Under this review, sites brought forward, if they were in an agricultural priority area, would not be listed for development. That's right?
That's
isn't it,
correct,
Simone?
that's correct, absolutely, yeah.
I have to say, just answering this question, I had such high hopes for this review that we'd come forward, that we'd be using all brownfield sites. But you have a set of criteria that you need to go through. It's robust, it's transparent, and we can only take what people have actually put forward within the call for sites. We couldn't go out just sort of picking a site, because we need to make sure that it is actually deliverable in the next 5 years. Otherwise, we don't have a hope in hell in actually meeting our targets at all. So they had to be available in the next 5 years.
Just to further add, although we've allocated six of the 6 new sites for affordable housing, we're still expecting a lot of development to come through windfall development, which will be a lot of it, or most of it, will be through main centres, local centres, or subdivision outside of centres. So it's not just about what's going to happen on those new affordable housing sites, which the 6 of them are expected to deliver only about 172 houses. So actually the majority of development we are still expecting to come forward through existing main centres, brownfield sites, and the windfall development.
And one thing that can actually be shown over previous time is, I think it's something like, correct me if I'm wrong, 92% of all our housing has actually come from windfall sites within the main centre.
A large proportion in the last number of years has been windfall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think last year it was 100% was from windfall sites, wasn't it? Those were the only sites developed. The bad news there is that last year we had developed 94 or 95 new houses. Those all in the private sector at different values, not cheap, I think people are finding. Whereas our capacity, we think, could be up to 300. It's difficult to make things happen. We're the planning board, we're not a building board. It's difficult to make things happen. Last year we also lost a major building contractor, which has probably not helped in getting things built. And obviously we've had the high cost of materials, massive inflation there, and a problem with having enough building staff to do the building. So the figures for last year were somewhat disappointing in terms of what has been built. And on top of that, obviously, we've got the issue with the immigration figures, which have gone up to quite a large number last year, to over 600, which is something that Home is going to have to look at. So all these things are linked, but not everything can be dealt with on the planning front.
Exactly.
But they are all under review, in one way or another.
Moving on to question 10. What traffic impact assessments have been considered in the areas which are already busy and narrow lanes, particularly the school pickup at times? With all these sites, they've all been looked at for the traffic, and particularly with the schools, this is where we will be writing to education to make sure that they have their say on the sites. And this is your time to come in and say what you think, but they've all been looked at for utilities, for traffic, and if you can actually access the sites to make sure there's good access. So just have your say on which ones you think that aren't appropriate for the plan. George, want to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been an assessment of these sites against the criteria and looked at them. That's why they're being brought forward. Preliminary assessments say they could be suitable for the housing. But this is your time. This is what the inspector is here to do. It is a third party that's going to test these proposals and see whether they're the best options, considering all the alternatives in front of us, and whether they're based on sound and credible evidence. So this is your chance to raise it with the inspector and say what you think about these proposals.
Does anyone have anything else to say on that?
Just to confirm that, all of the shortlisted sites went for consultation to the Traffic and Highways Department. So
Yep.
it wasn't planning internally determining whether there were any red flags with transport and accessibility. So it went for proper consultation with the Traffic and Highways.
And if I could add, your representations, which are important, and you're probably sceptical about whether we listen to you, but we do actually listen very hard. So your representations are looked at by the inspector, and they're looked at by the committee
Yep.
before we make final decisions, and we do genuinely do that. So do say what you've got to say, and if you're having trouble with the forms, do go to Edward T. Wiedenhouse, where you'll get some help in doing it. It's slightly daunting, but it can be done.
Definitely. We'll move on to question 11 from Paul. Are the DPA confident that the proposals will not have a significantly negative impact on those living and working in and around the proposed areas? Simone.
Yeah, again, the sites have been assessed for various reasons in terms of accessibility, in terms of their suitability to bring forward for housing development, and the preliminary assessment is showing that can be done. Obviously, the detailed design and the number of houses and exactly how they will look and how they're accessed will come forward at the planning application stage. But at the moment, yes, we are. The assessment is saying that they can come forward.
I think the biggest thing and I know I've lived next to a building site before, and I can see where people are coming from. They're probably a bit nervous about seeing the sites next to their houses. But the biggest problem is that we are in a housing crisis and we do need houses. So although it might not be nice to live next to a building site for a while, we need houses for our young people, otherwise we're going to see them all go off island. So I just hope that people can sort of take that into consideration. But please, again, have your say if you think there's more suitable sites.
I think it's, if we look at the bigger picture, the state has agreed to aim for a gradual increase of population
Yep.
by about 300 people per year until 2040. The rationale for that, and we had the debate last year, is really in line with our fiscal position, the importance of having the right workforce to support the economy and the community we've got, to support the public services. So I think this goes back to the very challenging balance as an island community on a very small footprint that we live on, which is smaller than Jersey, much smaller than Isle of Man, and the really competing demands that we've got between providing the housing, the infrastructure, the schools, the public services, versus enjoying what we love about Guernsey, which is hopefully that it continues to be the fantastic place to live and enjoy.
But it's also making sure that we've got enough office space and industrial as well. So there's a real balancing act to be had between everything, and it is a little bit of a tightrope walk for the DPA, managing the sort of development side of it and also the natural side of it, as natural Guernsey as well. Question 12 from Tony. Why are you proposing building houses on greenfield sites when there are still greenhouse sites that haven't been developed for the housing? As I said before, I was really hoping that more brownfield sites would come forward, but you've got to apply with a number of documents. You've got to look at the strategic housing indicator as what houses you actually need. And then you've also, more importantly, got to look at the strategic land use plan, which says where you can actually put development. The spatial plan says that you've got to have it in main centres and local centres, which at November 2016, they were actually put within the IDP itself. And we've looked at to make sure that there's enough land for the next 5 years. Those sites have to be adjacent or right next to the main centres. So that's why you're quite sort of almost constrained where you can put these houses. They can't just be pepper potted around the island where all the green houses are. They have to be in strategic locations, which many might find frustrating, but that's where they have to go because that's the plan that the states had 11 years ago. And I know the states sort of speak about whether it's still up to date, but it's a very high level plan, and it's to keep our green spaces green and our towns sort of actually with the houses. Did you want to come in any more on that?
Yeah, I mean, as part of the process and what you've already said in previous answers is your role is here about where is the land supply, is it there and is it available to be brought forward for development. Unfortunately, you can't force people to develop.
Yes.
And part of this process was very interesting when we did the call for sites, where we asked people whether they were willing to bring forward their land for affordable housing or not. And there was very few submissions that were for affordable housing.
Yeah.
So we're working within that constraints of making sure that it is actually deliverable and available.
Thank you ever so much. Moving on to question 13, it's from Carla and Graham. Why do we need 6 new affordable housing allocations when we already have existing housing allocations which have not been progressed? And what is the evidence to support this? Did you want to... Sorry, I cut you off earlier, I know that.
No, it's fine.
I can answer this.
Yeah.
So,
I'm happy to answer that. I think it was very important that we looked at having enough land supply for both private market housing and affordable housing. The private market housing pipeline, it doesn't just consist of housing allocation sites. It also consists of the potential, the windfall development and some of the existing applications that might come through. The experience we've seen is that, for example, not all applications translate into development. So we have to take into account that even we might have the whole pipeline and land allocated, doesn't mean we will get the development. And also, it is not currently within our remit to have penalties or incentives for progressing development. Again, this is something that's being considered elsewhere. We considered that it wouldn't be appropriate to reallocate some of the existing housing sites for affordable housing instead, because it would be extremely controversial and lead to probably no development from developers as well. So I think it's been a very tight balancing act. And actually what we hear from developers still today is that they want more land allocated for private housing. So it's almost a no win for us, because everyone wants something slightly different. So it's finding that balance, that to actually making sure the housing comes forward.
Yes, if I could,
also to answer the question is that where we got the numbers from is from the strategic housing indicator, which gives us what numbers we actually need to predicting over the next 5 years that we actually need. So what we looked at that, we took those numbers and we actually said, we've seen a higher number in population that's come in this year, so we're going to put a buffer in there of 15% for private market and 25% for affordable housing to make sure that we've got the land supply for there. But all the figures actually include the housing allocation sites as well. So it's not just us sort of picking out saying we need 6 figures. It's all done through evidence to make sure that we can provide Guernsey with the best possible housing over the next 5 years. And we don't want to over-cater land for things, because we want to make sure we keep green areas green. I'm going to move on to question 14 from Claire. Why are state-owned sites not being developed ahead of the 6 new sites allocated for affordable housing, i.e. Bray Lodge was specifically mentioned as an example? John, did you want to answer this one?
Yes, that's a very good question, actually. The state does own a lot of sites, including Bray Lodge, which is one it bought quite recently. From a private developer. It's quite close to the hospital, and I think it might be slated for nursing accommodation. The state does own a lot of land and property that is not considered available within the next 5 years. So what we're working with are figures for the next 5 years, and trying to ensure that we've provided the possibility that they can be met. The state owns a lot of land which is not included within what is deemed to be available, because it's not considered available within the next 5 years. There could be 400 to 800 houses in that zone, but they are not counted because they're not available within the next 5 years. So in due course, they will become available. They might be sold, they might be developed. But that's why there are properties that are not included within the figures that we're working with.
Also, though, Bray Lodge has actually had a planning application which has come forward. And I think the other area which you're probably talking about is the Cattell Hospital. Now, that has been reallocated within the main centre. It's not been allocated for housing because there's currently a large number of people actually there and working there. So we've had to make sure, as John say, that it's going to come forward in the next 5 years. Does anyone want to?
Yes, Cattell Hospital still has several hundred.
180 people currently
180
working
people from health working there, and they're going to have to be moved out. I'm not sure how soon we can do that, but once they are, that's a very large site. It's not just the hospital. There's quite a bit of land behind it that can...
I think just to clarify, I think we're talking about King Edward. So Cattell, obviously, we have allocated it as that it could come forward for development. King Edward has not been yet allocated. But there are other sites, for example, Frossard House car park is another one. We have worked very closely with the state's property unit to identify which are the sites that could come forward for development. So I think we have considered everything that was possible within the next five years. But, again, we welcome representations and suggestions of otherwise.
So we'll move on to question 15 from Paul. Will the review consider removing housing allocation sites that are not considered appropriate by the community? Simone, would you like to answer that one?
Well, again, it's the overall study has shown within the main centres that there is existing housing allocations that were brought through with the Island Development Plan. There's existing boundaries to those main centres that have been identified, and the proposed amendment is not looking to change that. They are relying on these existing land coming forward for development to work towards private market housing, and also looking for them to come forward for affordable housing. So there's a number of existing housing allocations that are actually owned by the states that would be expected to come forward for affordable housing and form part of that supply. So overall, no is the answer. None of the assessments reassessed all of these sites, suggested that they should be removed from the housing land supply.
Thank you. Simone? Sasha?
We will listen to the community and the strength of representations, and I think it's possible that traffic again will come up. It's a continuous issue that comes up with pretty much any development, and this is where we really need to get the other departments in the states to work with us to deliver a transport improvement plan. Environment and Infrastructure Committee are undergoing through consultation for their better transport plan. And I guess this is what we need together with any IDP review or housing delivery plan is a supporting transport and infrastructure plan. And we would really encourage our colleagues in other departments to make sure that that happens and is prioritized between today and the next political term.
Thank you ever so much for that. Question 16 from Graham. Won't building on greenfield sites negatively affect our biodiversity? I can say no to that because we've got the strategy of nature which was adopted 2 years ago, and basically any development that comes forward now, it has to have a biodiversity net gain. So even though you're seeing buildings go up, there still can be great biodiversity within those housing sites. You only have to look at sort of what you put sort of like, I call them buffers, but it's sort of like the edge of the housing sites to protect noise coming from the road and vice versa. And those areas are so important to a housing site. I think if anything is designed correctly, it should be a real enhancement to the island. If anything's negatively, it won't get through the planning process. So biodiversity should not be a problem within the housing sites. I think that's all that needs to be said, yeah. The last question, question 17 from Carla. Have the deputies on the panel personally visited all the proposed sites? I can't say from individual deputies, but I know that I have visited every single site of the new 6 sites that are coming forward. We haven't actually gone out as a group yet, but I imagine before the final decision, we will have to go see all the sites.
They have
Is
been
that-
visited by the officers
Yeah,
as
yes,
part
of
of the
course.
assessment, but no, there's not a whole group of the DPA have been out to see them.
That's going to be part of the process.
Yes. It will be at a later date before we make the final decisions. I don't know if any. I
We
don't
have,
know,
I think
Sasha, if you have-
individually we would have visited or know some of the sites, but we will make sure that once we're in the final stage of the report and recommendations, that we absolutely consider and have an in-depth visit to all of the final sites that will be put forward to the Assembly.
Thank you. John, did you want to say anything?
No, I've got nothing to add.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid that was our last question. So thank you so much for those of you that have joined us online this evening. Thank you for those that have sent their questions in as well. And finally, thank you for the panel for taking part in this evening. Please remember that even if you have submitted questions this evening or emailed your deputies about the proposed changes, there are 2 ways to formally comment on these changes, which is either by using the online consultation form, which is available at gov.gg/IDP review, or by filling in the representation form, which is available from Edward Weedon House. The deadline for filling in the form is the 5 o'clock on the 29th of July. Please do have your say. It helps to shape the island development plan. At the moment, I look at this as a DPA plan, and it really needs to be an island development plan. And for all of that to go ahead, we need your comments, we need your representations to make sure it's reflecting what Guernsey actually wants. So thank you ever so much for listening, and goodbye.